She walked into the most powerful office on earth with 6 weeks of preparation, a continent's worth of leverage, and the quiet certainty of a woman who had survived every political storm Europe had thrown at her for 2 decades. She walked out 11 minutes early, her hands trembling, a $2.3 trillion invoice pressed against her fingers, and the absolute knowledge that she had just said 3 words that would be studied in history books as the moment the Western world, as it had existed since 1945, ceased to function. Ursula von der Leyen had prepared for every version of that conversation. She had not prepared for the version where her refusal was the answer Donald Trump had traveled across time to hear, because Trump didn't walk into that meeting looking for a deal. He walked in holding a detonator. And when she said, "I will not pay," she didn't defuse the bomb. She pressed the button herself. The invitation should have been the first warning, when the White House communication reached Brussels in the third week of March. It did not arrive through the standard diplomatic architecture that governs contact between leaders of allied powers. There were no coordinated press releases prepared in advance, no joint statement framework circulated to both sides for pre-approval, and no choreographed Rose Garden appearance penciled into the schedule to give the meeting the optics of partnership. What arrived instead was a communication so stripped of the ceremonial language that normally cushions these encounters that senior officials inside the Berlaymont building described it internally as something closer to a summons than an invitation. One official who reviewed the original text said it read the way a creditor writes to a borrower who has stopped returning calls. The tone was not hostile. It was something more unsettling than hostile. It was final. Van der Leyen's inner circle understood immediately that the normal rules of transatlantic engagement had been suspended. This was not going to be a working session between the leaders of allied economies. This was not going to produce a joint communique, a roadmap for deepened cooperation, or any of the other vocabulary that European institutions use to paper over the structural tensions that have been building across the Atlantic for years. This was going to be a reckoning. And the only question her team faced in the 6 weeks between receiving that communication and boarding the plane to Washington was whether they could prepare thoroughly enough to survive it. They tried. The preparation that van der Leyen's team assembled in those 6 weeks was, by every account from those who participated in it, the most comprehensive briefing operation the European Commission had mounted for a bilateral meeting in recent memory. Trade flow data covering every major sector of transatlantic commerce. Defense expenditure breakdowns demonstrating NATO burden sharing increases across member states going back a full decade. GDP interdependency models quantifying exactly how deeply the American and European economies had grown into each other since the post-war reconstruction. Legal frameworks governing Article 5 mutual defense obligations. Economic impact assessments covering every tariff scenario the Commission's modeling teams could construct. They ran war room simulations inside the Berlaymont that went past midnight. They stress-tested every argument. They assigned senior officials to play Trump's negotiating team and instructed them to be as aggressive and as unpredictable as possible. They gamed out the conversation from 40 different angles and prepared responses for each one. What they were doing, though they would not have described it this way at the time, was preparing for a negotiation. They were sharpening arguments, rehearsing concession packages, constructing red lines, and building the kind of comprehensive position that wins at the table when both sides are operating inside the same framework of shared assumptions about what the table is for. The catastrophic error buried inside all of that preparation was the assumption that Trump intended to negotiate at all. He didn't. He had not flown across the Atlantic in his mind to find a middle ground. He had been building something for 6 months in the rooms of the Treasury Department, the National Security Council, and the offices of advisors whose names never appear in newspaper coverage. And the meeting with van der Leyen was not the beginning of that process. It was the delivery mechanism for its conclusion. Her plane touched down at Joint Base Andrews in the gray early morning light of a Tuesday. The motorcade moved through Washington with the authority of state, flags cutting through the pre-dawn traffic, security detail running the route with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this exact sequence hundreds of times. Inside the limousine, van der Leyen reviewed her opening position one final time. Europe has increased collective NATO defense spending by over $600 billion across the past decade. The commitment is real. The trajectory is upward. And the Commission is prepared to table a structured acceleration framework that will satisfy American burden-sharing expectations without triggering the domestic political crisis that a sudden demand for spending increases would produce in Paris, Berlin, or Rome. She had the arguments, she had the data, she had the composure that 2 decades of European institutional politics had forged into something close to physical armor. She had no idea the weapon pointed at her was specifically designed to go straight through armor. The heavy doors of the Oval Office closed behind her delegation with a sound that everyone present on the European side would later describe with the same word, though none of them had coordinated on it. Final. The room was arranged wrong. The seating configuration that protocol dictates for a bilateral meeting between heads of government had been altered in a way that was subtle enough to be deniable and deliberate enough to be unmistakable. Van der Leyen's team found themselves compressed toward the entrance. The American side commanded the deeper space of the room, the space behind the resolute desk, the space that in the geometry of power communicates ownership. One of her senior advisors later described the arrangement as the first sentence of a conversation that had not yet started. Trump was standing at the center of the room, not moving toward her, not performing the automatic social choreography of welcome that every head of government performs when a counterpart enters the room, regardless of what they think of that counterpart, because the performance itself is the message that the institution is intact. He was planted, arms locked across his chest, his jaw set in an expression that her delegation would later describe not as anger, not as contempt, but as something colder and more deliberate than either. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. Every person on the European side of the room would later agree on that number with a consistency that came not from coordination, but from the simple fact that each of those seconds had been felt physically, like pressure accumulating in a sealed space. Van der Leyen extended her hand. It was the reflex of a woman who had built a career on the power of composure, the automatic gesture of civilization extended across a room where civilization was already being quietly revoked. Trump looked at her hand. He did not take it. He held her gaze and let the moment stretch past the point of awkwardness, past the point of diplomatic accident, into the territory of deliberate, calculated humiliation. She lowered her arm. The message had been delivered before a single word had been spoken. You are not here as a partner. You are here as a debtor. You know why you're here. No title, no courtesy, no pretense of the theater that normally insulates these encounters from the raw arithmetic of power. Just the flat declaration of a man who had decided weeks ago how this meeting would end and was now simply walking through the sequence he had already written. A plain manila folder was placed on the resolute desk and slid toward her with the casual motion of someone passing an overdue bill across a table. She opened it. The number at the center of the page was $2.3 trillion. It was not a negotiating figure. It was not an opening position designed to be walked back through the familiar mechanics of diplomatic compromise. It was a forensic accounting, exhaustive in its construction, itemized across 73 years. Every dollar of American military expenditure in Europe since the Marshall Plan, categorized, totaled, and presented as a debt that the European Union had been quietly accumulating while building its social democracies on a foundation of American security it had never honestly priced. She looked up from the page. The room was absolutely still, and then she said the three words that her preparation, her arguments, her 6 weeks of war room sessions, and her 2 decades of political survival instinct had all converged on as the only acceptable response. I will not pay. She said it with the full institutional weight of an office representing 450 million people. She said it with the composure of a woman who had rehearsed it. She said it with the absolute conviction of someone who believed in that moment that she was drawing a line. Trump smiled, slow, controlled, and patient in a way that was more terrifying than any raised voice could have been. The smile of a man who had placed a trap 6 months ago and had just watched it close exactly as designed. That, he said, dropping his voice to just above a whisper, is exactly what I hoped you'd say. She had not drawn a line. She had signed a document. And the machine Trump had spent 6 months building in the quiet rooms of Washington was already running. What came next would not just threaten European trade or European defense or European diplomacy. What came next had been engineered to collapse the entire architecture that European civilization had rested on since the end of the Second World War. And Van der Leyen, standing in the center of the Oval Office with her folders and her arguments and her composure fracturing at the edges, was about to find out that the most dangerous trap is not the one that closes around you. It is the one you lock yourself inside with your own hands. How do you survive a machine that was built specifically around the 3 words you were always going to say? Trump did not return to his chair. He began to move slowly, with the measured deliberation of a man who had rehearsed this moment until it had become something closer to instinct than performance. He traced the perimeter of the Oval Office in a wide, unhurried circuit. And with every pass, the room felt smaller, the air thicker, The distance between van der Leyen and the door behind her somehow greater than the architecture could account for. She stood at the Resolute desk with the folder still open in front of her and the number still burning off the page, and watched the President of the United States transform the most recognized office on earth into a courtroom where the verdict had been written before she landed at Andrews. He was not performing anger. He was not performing anything. What made the next 40 minutes so uniquely devastating was the total absence of theater. Trump was calm, methodical, and precise in the way that a structural engineer is calm when describing exactly which load-bearing wall he intends to remove and exactly what will happen to the building when he does. He told her he had spent 6 months constructing a machine. He told her she had just pressed the start button. And then, wave by wave, with the unhurried patience of someone who has already won and is simply explaining the score, he began to describe exactly what that machine was going to do to the continent she had spent her career holding together. The first wave was economic, and it had not been designed to wound Europe. It had been designed to execute specific governments by collapsing the domestic political conditions that kept them functional. Trump walked her through the tariff architecture his Treasury team had constructed with a granularity that made clear beyond any possibility of misreading that this was not improvisation and not a leveraged position to be walked back through the familiar mechanics of negotiation. This was engineering, 60% tariffs on European automobiles, effective within 30 days. The number detonated inside the room with the quiet force of something that does not need to be loud to be catastrophic. The European automotive sector was not simply an industry. It was the industrial skeleton of the continent's largest and most politically consequential economy. Germany's entire post-war identity, its claim to continental leadership, its export dominance, its political stability, the basic social contract between its government and its working population, all of it rested on the ability of Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz to move product into the American market at competitive prices. Trump had just priced them out of that market overnight. 30 days, he said again, with a quiet emphasis that made the repetition feel less like a reminder and more like a countdown already running. By the time Brussels finished convening its first emergency committee session to draft a formal diplomatic response, the damage would already be structural and irreversible. German factories would be cutting shifts within weeks. German unions would be mobilizing. The German government, already operating on a dangerously thin political margin after years of coalition instability, would be consumed by a domestic industrial crisis of a scale it had not faced since reunification, leaving it with nothing left to spend on European solidarity and no political bandwidth to coordinate with Paris, Rome, or Warsaw on a unified continental response. But the automotive sector was only the opening incision. Trump moved through the rest of the tariff schedule with the same unhurried surgical calm. 55% on French pharmaceuticals and Italian industrial machinery, 50% on luxury goods, the wines, the perfumes, the fashion houses, the entire cultural export architecture that kept the French economy's soft power engine financially viable. Each figure had not been chosen arbitrarily. Each figure had been calibrated with forensic precision against the specific economic vulnerability of a specific member state, targeting the exact sectors where domestic political pain would be most immediately acute and most impossible for the government in question to absorb without crisis. Paris, Berlin, Rome, Vienna, each capital had been studied, mapped, and targeted simultaneously at its most exposed point. The strategic logic was not to attack the European Union as a unified bloc, because a unified bloc can coordinate a unified response. The logic was to attack each member, government individually and simultaneously at the precise point of maximum domestic sensitivity, ensuring that each capital would be too consumed by its own internal emergency to look beyond its own borders long enough to build the coalition that a collective European response required. It was a fragmentation strategy dressed as a tariff schedule, and it had been constructed by people who understood the internal fracture lines of European politics at a level of granularity that the Commission had catastrophically failed to anticipate. The second wave was financial, and it was the wave that drained the color from van der Leyen's face in a way that the tariff figures, devastating as they were, had not quite managed. Trump explained, with the same quiet and clinical calm he had maintained since the moment she entered the room, that the United States Treasury had at that precise moment begun the process of notifying the Federal Reserve and the network of primary dealers that access to dollar-denominated liquidity for European central banks was being reclassified as a national security matter subject to immediate strategic review. For a continent whose entire financial architecture had been constructed on the foundational assumption of frictionless, unconditional access to the global dollar system. This was not a warning shot. It was the removal of oxygen from a sealed room. The euro did not exist in isolation from the dollar. European sovereign debt was priced against American benchmarks. European banks cleared their international transactions through dollar-anchored systems. European governments funded the social programs that defined their political identities, the universal healthcare, the pension structures, the public university systems, through bond markets whose stability depended entirely on the implicit guarantee that Washington stood behind the Western financial order as its ultimate guarantor. Trump was removing that guarantee not through a dramatic announcement, not through a declaration that would generate a headline and give Brussels a fixed point to respond to. He was removing it bureaucratically, through the slow mechanism of a regulatory review that would never produce a single dramatic moment, but would instead generate a steady, accelerating pressure across every financial institution on the continent. A pressure that would build quietly in the plumbing of the system until it became impossible to contain. Bond yields across the Eurozone would begin to rise within days as the markets processed what the reclassification meant. Borrowing costs would climb. The European Central Bank would intervene, but its interventions would become progressively less effective as the scale of the structural shift was absorbed into market pricing. The social programs that formed the bedrock of European political legitimacy would begin to crack under the weight of a sovereign borrowing crisis that no amount of continental solidarity statements could paper over, because solidarity statements do not move bond markets, they do not lower interest rates, and they do not replace the American backstop that had been quietly, permanently removed from the equation. Trump looked directly at her when he described this phase. He named her flagship programs. He asked, with a tone that contained no genuine curiosity, how Europe intended to fund its guaranteed pensions, its free universities, and its universal healthcare when the cost of sovereign borrowing tripled and the markets finally finished pricing in the reality that the American guarantee was gone. It was not a question. It was the clinical description of a collapse already in motion. And van der Leyen, standing in the center of the room with her briefing documents, her rehearsed responses, and her 6 weeks of preparation, had no answer, because the machine Trump had described was not theoretical and it was not a negotiating position. It was operational, and it had been designed by people who understood that Europe's deepest and most catastrophically unacknowledged vulnerability was not its military exposure or its energy dependence. It was its absolute, structurally invisible, decades-long dependency on an American financial architecture it had spent an entire generation pretending it had outgrown. The room had changed. The air inside the Oval Office carried a different quality now, heavier and closer, and van der Leyen's advisors stood behind her in a silence so rigid it had become its own form of communication. Their prepared documents sat in their folders like maps of a country that had just been removed from the atlas. 2 waves had hit, and the third had not arrived yet. And the third was the one that would not threaten Europe's economy or its financial system or its political cohesion. The third was the one that would threaten something older,